So, Whitney. If you've ever played Pokemon and are above a certain age, there is a very strong chance that you have at least a few bad memories associated with that name. She's the third gym leader the player faces in the Johto games, she specializes in normal types, and for years, her gym battle has been widely considered one of the toughest in all of Pokemon. A few months ago, I made a similar video about Watson, where I tested every single Pokemon available prior to his battle in order to see whether his reputation was actually earned. Whitney, I can say straight away, is going to be a bit of a different case. With Watson, it was possible to sweep by simply spamming one attack. He mainly just seemed difficult because the team building requirements for doing so were pretty hyper-specific, and I considered him to be rather poorly balanced, because there were almost no possible results in between that and him being almost unbeatable. Whitney and her team certainly have weaknesses, but they don't tend to be completely crippling like ground types were for Watson's Magneton. No matter what you put on your team, she's pretty much always going to be able to do something to you. Most of the best counters to Whitney tend to minimize risk, rather than practically avoid it completely. Between all of the Generation 2 games put together, there are around 60 different evolutionary families available prior to earning the Plain Badge, and I tested every single one of them in order to see which ones can get the player past Whitney, the most infamous gym leader in Johto. Like many notoriously tough gym battles, Whitney's strength mainly comes from one specific Pokemon, her ace, Miltank. Unlike many other infamous gym leader aces though, like Misty's Starmie that crits nearly every turn, or Claire's Kingdra that effectively has no weaknesses, or Watson's impossibly evolved Magneton, on paper nothing about Miltank seems especially broken. This is a Pokemon that the player isn't given access to yet, but only barely. In fact, I'm pretty sure defeating Whitney is the flag that unlocks the ability to catch them. This is far earlier than you're given access to any of the previously mentioned gym leader aces, and while Miltank's base stat total is relatively high for this point in the adventure, there are a good number of other Pokemon which are available to the player and match or even surpass her. She doesn't even use any damage-dealing moves that are kept from the player. She does have Attract, but this can easily be played around by simply using female Pokemon. One thing that may have made Whitney stand out from the other gym leaders was the type she specializes in. Despite being one of the most common, Normal is actually a very unusual type, in that it almost exists outside of the type chart. It doesn't hit anything for super effective damage and barely resists anything, but conversely, it has very few weaknesses and almost nothing resists it. They also tend to have very wide move pools, even in the older games when learn sets were usually a lot more limited, making it actually quite difficult to have a proper type advantage over them. The strategy most players would be used to against gym leaders is to just teach one of their Pokemon a super effective move and spam it, but against Whitney's team, whose only weakness was a type that, at least at this point in the series, was relatively uncommon, that wasn't going to be an option for many players. Another thing that may have tripped people up was Miltank's pretty unusual stat distribution, being an example of the very rare Speedy Tank. This fat cow, who isn't even standing up in her battle sprite, is actually faster than almost any Pokemon available to the player at this point in the game. I believe there are a grand total of 3 that can potentially outspeed her, and even for them it can depend on the stats you roll. Even if you do outspeed her, there's nothing that reliably one-shots Miltank at this point in the adventure. There's not even much that reliably two-shots, and this is made more of an issue by the fact that Miltank has a self-healing move in Miltank. And somehow she has all of this while still having a not-too-shabby attack stat. I'm just gonna say it, if it was intentional, I think this was actually a pretty genius stat distribution for a boss Pokemon. The test works the exact same way as it did in the Watson video. All Pokemon were tested at Whitney's level cap, which in these games is level 20, with middling DVs and no stat experience. I would first test the Pokemon by leading with them and seeing if they were capable of sweeping the fight, and then by seeing if they were capable of just 1v1ing Miltank. Testing did take quite a bit longer this time, not only because there are a wider variety of different evolutionary families available in this region, not only because the UI for the Gen 2 PC storage is a lot less intuitive than the later games, not only because there wasn't really a pilot study I could perform to filter out a bunch of Pokemon immediately. Unlike Watson's Magnemite, Whitney's Clefairy isn't just a weaker version of her ace, and in fact, there was a single Pokemon I tested that was able to defeat Miltank, but not Clefairy. Not only because I have to take 3 sets of version exclusives into account instead of 2, since unlike Watson and Emerald, Whitney's battle in Crystal is identical to how it was in Gold and Silver, but also because this time round, I decided to test the different stages of any Pokemon with a difficult evolution method separately. I originally thought this would only apply to Pokemon that evolve via trade, however, I decided to extend it to any Pokemon that evolves via friendship, because while it is possible to get it high enough to evolve them this early, it can be a bit of a tedious process. As well as any Pokemon that evolves via stone, since these can be quite annoying to get in Johto, and in some cases availability is dependent on the version you're playing. I nearly thought I would have to test every Pokemon as a male and a female as well, due to Miltank knowing Attract, but thankfully she didn't use it every fight, so I could just use the attempts where she didn't use it as a reference. For every Pokemon where this is relevant, just assume everything I'm saying works even more reliably if the Pokemon you're using is female. In the end, this resulted in 81 different Pokemon being tested. Let's see how many of them could defeat Whitney. In Generation 2, they introduced a new type of move that I don't think has an official name, so I'll just call it an incremental attack. Basically, a move that doubles in power every consecutive turn it hits before maxing out at a certain point. 2 of these moves are given to the player as TMs relatively early in the adventure. Fury Cutter is given as the prize at Bugsy's gym, and Rollout can be found on Route 35 just north of Goldenrod City. They can be learned by a very wide variety of Pokemon, and there are many cases where a Pokemon that would otherwise at best be a fairly mediocre Miltank counter can use them to solo the entire fight quite often. It's not the most reliable strategy in the world, considering these moves only have 90% accuracy, and if the chain breaks at an inconvenient moment, it can really screw you over, so with a few exceptions, if you're doing a Nuzlocke or something, I wouldn't really recommend this strategy except as an absolute last resort. Any other style of gameplay, however, this might be one of the best options there is. Bayleef, being able to learn Fury Cutter, is the first of many Pokemon to benefit from this strategy. Using only the level up moves, they simply do not do enough damage. Miltank can easily stall them out with Milk Drink and out-damage Bayleef at the same time. But if Bayleef successfully builds up Fury Cutter on Clefairy, they can win fairly often, so long as they don't miss on an inconvenient turn or get flinched by Stomp, especially if they hold a berry to get a bit of extra health. Setting up on Clefairy is an issue in and of itself, though. I actually have to amend a comment I made earlier, when I said Whitney's strength was mainly contained to her Miltank. Clefairy isn't really a threat at all if you just attack with the intent of knocking her out quickly, but it absolutely can be a bit dangerous to leave her on the field too long, since she can roll literally any move in the game with Metronome. The more turns you leave her out in order to set up, the more chances you give her to roll something crazy. This is one of the main reasons why even most of the very best strategies against Whitney aren't 100% consistent. There's always a bit of a luck factor with this Clefairy that's almost impossible to reliably play around. As for Bayleef, not the best incremental attack user, but a solid enough one if you have no other options. Quilava doesn't fare quite as well as the Grass-type starter. They're both much more defensively frail and weak to Rock-type moves, which Rollout is. The idea is obviously that defenses are sacrificed in favor of more speed, but Quilava gets outsped by Miltank anyway, so that provides no advantage here. They just wind up consistently having fewer chances to attack. The level up learn set does nothing, and trying to set up with Fury Cutter or Rollout, Quilava usually just takes too much damage from Clefairy, let alone Miltank. With this setup, virtually the only way Quilava can win is if Miltank misses with her Rollout. Using the Gold Berry, a pretty rare item in this game, in addition, makes the sweep a bit more likely, but Quilava really has to be at both pretty much full health and have Fury Cutter or Rollout nearly fully charged at the time Miltank comes out for this matchup to maybe work. Honestly, Quilava is probably more likely to 1v1 Miltank by two-shotting with Fire Blast from the game corner, though of course they have to hit the rather inaccurate move both turns, and not get crit. Plus, from what I saw in my testing, Miltank seemed a lot more likely to use Attract on a Pokemon that was just sent in against her, rather than a Pokemon that was already on the field when she was sent in. So unless you're using a female Pokemon, it's mostly best to avoid 1v1s if possible. Croconaw is the only one of the 3 starters that can solo Whitney's gym using only their level up learn set. Croconaw learns Rage, which is actually a very helpful move to know in this gym because the main attack Whitney's Clefairy uses is Double Slap. The way Rage works is it's kind of another incremental attack, but it's quite different from Rollout or Fury Cutter. It's 100% accurate, but only increases in power each time it's used consecutively if the opposing Pokemon lands an attack that turn. The reason why it's so good that Clefairy knows Double Slap is because each hit from a multi-strike move increases the power of Rage separately, so Clefairy usually increases the counter a lot. It's still not the most dependable thing because you are relying a bit on the AI cooperating with you, but it still tends to be far more reliable than Fury Cutter or Rollout, largely because it can't miss. Also, as a bonus, unlike those other two, the Rage Chain is only broken by the use of another move. If it does miss due to lowered accuracy, or Croconaw fails to get it off due to getting flinched or retracted, they can get right back on track the next time they do hit. The sweep is a bit shaky with no item, Croconaw can just run out of health, and even holding a berry, sometimes Clefairy just doesn't use Double Slap enough. But with the item, the sweep becomes very common, and holding a gold berry, Croconaw wins almost every time. That reliance on a relatively scarce item does need to be noted though. In the Watson video, I separated the tiers between Pokemon that made the tier using only their level up moves, or TMs and items that were easily accessible, and Pokemon that were only able to make the tier using the elusive TMs from the game corner. While I do think the game corner is far more reliably grindable in Johto than it is in Hoenn, largely in part because the slot machines actually work intuitively in this one, as you may have noticed with Quilava, I have elected to continue that separation here, because it can still be quite a tedious process that a lot of people would probably want to avoid if they can. However, the game corner TMs aren't the only hard to access moves and items in these games. It's kind of just a thing that Johto in particular is really weird and annoying with the availability of certain moves and items, such as the items that you can only get if you happen to be playing on a certain day of the week, items you can only get from the main character's mom if you saved enough money, items you can only get if a certain NPC happens to call you, and the Gold Berry, which can only be obtained this early from an in-game trade, or as specifically third prize in the bug catching contest. Any Pokemon that relies on one of these will have an asterisk. Some of the items you can only get from playing on certain days of the week are the TMs for Return and Frustration. A woman in the department store will give one of them to you depending on the friendship of the Pokemon you show her, but only if you happen to be playing on Sunday. Plus, their power varies widely depending on how long you've had the Pokemon you've taught it to. Towards the end of the adventure, Return is pretty reliable, but here towards the beginning, getting it to a decent power is a grind. Thankfully, because the Headbutt TM exists and is far more accessible, for most Pokemon I could just use that instead. For the Pokemon where I did have to use the friendship moves, I just tested them with the default friendship of 70, which, for the record, puts Frustration at 74 base power. Not that any of this made any difference to Pidgeotto. They 1v1 Clefairy just fine, but even with Frustration, absolutely cannot put a dent in Miltank. They can lower her accuracy with Sand Attack or Mud Slap, but even if they do get a miss from that, it pretty much just delays the inevitable. Fearow also can't make any headway with the level up learn set, but unlike Pidgeotto, Frustration actually makes a big difference for them. It increases Fearow's odds to almost exactly 50-50, actually. They can reliably make it to Miltank with no damage on them, if they hold the Pink Bow, another item you can only get this early if you happen to play on a certain day of the week, from one of the weekday siblings. Clefairy is a reliable one-shot, and Miltank is a reliable 3-shot. Plus, Fearow consistently takes 2 rollouts from Miltank, as long as she doesn't crit. The only thing that stops Fearow from making it higher on the tier list is the fact that they only outspeed Miltank 50% of the time. I'm testing every Pokemon with 8 DVs in every stat, which is about as close to average as you can get, and with these DVs, Fearow has a speed tie with Miltank. A Fearow with above average speed will almost always win this set, while a Fearow with lower than average speed will pretty much never win this set. This particular Fearow has to win the speed tie on specifically the 3rd turn. Though, the fact that they don't rely on setup or inaccurate moves at all does make Fearow one of the better Pokemon so far for just 1v1ing Miltank. You know, as long as they don't get attracted. Noctowl can put Miltank to sleep. This not only prevents Miltank from attacking for several turns, it can also break rollout chains and prevent Miltank from healing. Noctowl can also lower Miltank's attack with Growl, making Miltank's moves less threatening when she does wake back up, and possibly giving Noctowl more of a chance to put her back to sleep. The problem is not only that Hypnosis is only 60% accurate, and that this strategy is heavily reliant on the amount of turns Miltank remains asleep for, which is random, but also that Noctowl can't do much in the way of damage themselves. Even with Frustration and a Pink Bow, Miltank is at least a 5-shot for Noctowl, and with the fact that they also have to use some of those setup moves for Growl, Miltank just isn't likely to stay asleep long enough. This is especially problematic when whittling down the second half of her health, because if she wakes up before going down, she can easily heal off several turns worth of damage with one milk drink. Noctowl can pull off a win every once in a while, but they have to get very lucky. No funny business with Raticate. They have a small chance of defeating Miltank by spamming Hyper Fang and just hoping that Rollout misses at least once, and it's as simple as that. Neither the Pink Bow nor the berries had any tangible effect on their chances whatsoever. Most of the time, the berry wouldn't even activate. Miltank's Rollout did an exact awkward amount of health, where the second round would put Raticate's health just outside the range where a berry would activate, but just inside the range where the third round of Rollout would KO. Furret is another of the many Pokemon on this list whose strength largely comes from an incremental attack, in this case Rollout. I did say this strategy wasn't the most reliable, although as we'll see, some Pokemon are far better at using these incremental attacks than others, and as a result, I'm still willing to rank some of them quite highly. Furret, for example, can pair Rollout up with Defense Curl. In addition to raising the user's defense, that move also doubles the power of the user's Rollout, meaning not only will a max power Rollout do far more damage, but it's also faster to get back on track if one of them happens to miss, as the Defense Curl effect remains until the Pokemon is switched out. They miss out on the very top tier because they are kind of at the whim of accuracy, but Furret genuinely almost never lost during my testing. Whitney rarely even came close to winning, and they weren't even using a berry or anything. There were a couple of losses dotted here and there, but even some of those probably could have been recovered if I was just spamming a bit less. I am speculating here, but I think it's possible the reason Furret feels so consistent compared to most other Rollout and Fury Cutter users is that even if Rollout misses late in the chain, Furret generally does enough damage with Quick Attack, or maybe Headbutt if they can survive Miltank's next attack, that they could sometimes just finish Miltank off with that instead. Pichu can only be obtained this early via the Odd Egg in Pokemon Crystal. They can only sometimes just barely defeat Clefairy even while using TMs, and then they're one-shot by Miltank anyway. Pichu pretty much never even gets a chance to use a move against the ace. Even after evolving into Pikachu, they still rely on TMs to get past Clefairy with any amount of frequency, and if they took any amount of damage from Clefairy in the process, then they're just going to get KO'd by Miltank's Stomp immediately. If Pikachu somehow gets past Clefairy without taking any damage, or just 1v1s Miltank, they can rarely sneak in a win by just spamming Thunder and hoping it never misses, and hoping that at least one of the Thunders paralyzes, but that's obviously not very likely to happen. I also did a bit of experimenting with Double Team, but evasion strats just aren't very helpful on Pokemon that aren't tanky. The opponent will hit through eventually, and Pikachu will just go down then. You have to get lucky every time, while they only have to get lucky once. Butterfree is just a repeat of Noctowl, really. They can occasionally get a win, but they have to hit with Sleep Powder every time, and Miltank has to stay asleep enough turns. Unlike Noctowl, however, Butterfree was able to get a win or two using only their level up learn set. Sleep Powder is more accurate than Hypnosis, so Butterfree got a few more chances at having free turns, but conversely, Butterfree is double weak to Rollout while Miltank was only single weak, and Butterfree also had no way of lowering Miltank's damage output, so they wind up in the same tier in the end. Not gonna lie, after I discovered Fury Cutter, I kind of expected Beedrill to do better than they did. I thought getting same type attack bonus for Fury Cutter would do numbers, but since Miltank outspeeds, and even a fully charged Fury Cutter doesn't one-shot, Miltank pretty much always gets 2 chances to attack. and Beedrill has some of the frailest defensive stats out of any Pokemon I've tested so far. Beedrill goes down to the second rollout. I mean, it would nearly be a 2-shot even without the incremental build-up, so the only way they can possibly win is if Miltank misses at least once. Ledian was never even able to defeat Clefairy using their level up set. Even with Thunder Punch from the department store, the only somewhat better move they can learn, they make virtually no headway whatsoever. The gold exclusive counterpart bug Ariados doesn't do too great either. They can at least reliably get past Clefairy with only their level up learn set, and they survive a little bit longer against Miltank before inevitably going down to Rollout, being able to break chains with Dig, but ultimately, they still don't make any real headway. For the second time in a row in one of my experiments, Geodude has wound up being one of the best counters in the entire game. While I wouldn't say they completely wall Miltank, they're definitely one of the Pokemon that comes closest, having high physical defense and resisting both of her main attacking moves. They're able to take 4 incremental rounds of Rollout, more than any other Pokemon I've tested so far, and the slight majority of the time 1v1s the ace using only level up moves and no items, albeit they do either have to hope for a few decent magnitude rolls in a row, or at least one miss from Miltank's Rollout, or both. I've even seen them do it while attracted and giving Miltank a few free turns, although generally I would recommend not playing into this. Teaching Geodude Dig, they can do a somewhat lower, but far more consistent and reliable amount of damage, and also break Whitney's rollout chains. I would recommend combining this strategy with other attacks, like Magnitude or Rollout though, because using only Dig, Miltank is liable to stall Geodude out of PP with Milk Drink. Using Rollout, Geodude is practically unstoppable in this fight. Even if Miltank gets a head start with the chain, Geodude is still likely going to outdamage her. Between Geodude getting Defense Curl, getting same type attack bonus, and resisting Rollout themselves, it takes 3 or 4 incremental rounds of Rollout from Miltank to surpass the power of Geodude's first round. I've seen Geodude get the sweep while burned, I've seen Geodude get the sweep while missing and breaking the chain on just about every possible turn, and I only realized looking back at my footage that I was forgetting to even use Defense Curl most of the time. I think the only thing keeping Geodude out of the top tier is that you do have to leave Clefairy on the field for a good few turns while building up Rollout, and therefore you're giving her a lot of chances to roll something ridiculous with Metronome, especially since Clefairy outspeeds them, so she gets yet another turn on top of that. However, if you were to have a female Geodude just 1v1 Miltank, the matchup would probably be pretty close to 100% consistent. Anyway, Zubat does nothing in this fight, they're not even worth talking about. And then we get to Cleffa, another Pokemon you can only get this early from the Odd Egg and Crystal. This family has 2 different evolution methods that can be annoying to access this early in the adventure, so all 3 stages have to get their own ranking. Unlike some other baby Pokemon, Stomp isn't an outright one-shot on Cleffa, so they're at least able to get off an attack on Miltank, although they're still never going to be able to outdamage her. After evolving into Clefairy, they can win sometimes sweeping with Rollout, but unlike Furret and Geodude, they don't get any Defense Curl or same type attack bonus, plus they're a lot frailer, so they really rely on Rollout just never missing at any point, never getting flinched, and on not taking too much damage from Whitney's Clefairy so that Miltank doesn't just immediately roll a KO with Stomp. I suppose now is as good a time as any to bring it up, but Whitney's AI is really weird with the move Stomp in particular. It's by far her most damaging move in most scenarios, yet she only ever seems to use it when she rolls a KO. I have occasionally seen her use it in other scenarios, but it's quite rare, and there are a good few Pokemon, like Clefairy, who would probably be bumped down the tier list a bit if she would just use the move more consistently. Some Pokemon just totally depend on the AI cooperating. After evolving into Clefable, they do pretty much the same thing, only a bit more consistently due to the higher stats. Igglybuff was the first baby Pokemon who could both get through Clefairy and land an attack on Miltank in one run, but even getting that far required a pretty excessive amount of luck for them. The evolved Jigglypuff learns Rollout by level up, so that'd be a nice bonus, not having to use the TM, if Jigglypuff winds up being any good with the move. They do get Defense Curl, but unfortunately, despite having a lot of HP, Jigglypuff is almost as physically frail as the Blissey family, so they are often just going to take too much damage from Clefairy while trying to stack up rollouts. Another pretty large contributing factor is that most of the good rollout sweepers are faster than Clefairy, giving her one less turn to attack. Jigglypuff is one of the few Pokemon in the whole game that can't outspeed her. Sometimes they can get through Clefairy with little to no damage by putting her to sleep, but then Miltank also does well over half of Jigglypuff's health with Stomp post-Defense Curl, so they are totally reliant on Miltank just never using that move in order to get a win. Consistently throughout the whole evolutionary line, the Wigglytuff family does the same thing as the Clefable family in this battle, just a bit worse. Wigglytuff has about the same attack as Clefable, but far lower defense, so they just can't afford to take as many hits. Togepi is the first baby Pokemon to actually get a win with a rollout chain, on their first attempt as well, albeit it was pretty fluky. They had to take almost no damage from Clefairy, and they had to try and roll a real move with Metronome to finish off Miltank, although I could have avoided the latter by teaching Headbutt or something. I think what makes the slight difference with Togepi is that they do have noticeably higher defense than most of the other baby Pokemon, meaning they can afford a few extra hits from Clefairy before it gets to the point where Miltank would immediately roll a KO with Stomp. Their chances do improve after evolving into Togetic, but only to a certain extent, because while Togetic has higher stats, they are now weak to Miltank's rollout, so it does pretty much the same damage in the end. Another Pokemon that really has to hit all 5 rounds in order to win. Sandshrew does pretty much the exact same thing as Geodude on this fight. Highly defensive, can learn Defense Curl, Rollout, and Dig, resists Miltank's Rollout. They're not quite as good against Miltank because they don't get the same type attack bonus from Rollout, nor do they resist Miltank's Stomp, but neither of those things wind up making much of a tangible difference, especially since, like I said, Whitney's AI will almost never use Stomp. Plus, while Clefairy Metronome is still a risk factor, the lack of a double weakness makes Clefairy a little less likely to KO from randomly rolling a super effective move, so while the 1v1 with Miltank is a little worse than Geodude, though would still probably be close to 100% consistent with a female Sandshrew, the full sweep might actually be slightly safer with Sandshrew. Ekans also does absolutely nothing on this fight, but there are a couple of other snake Pokemon that do great. One of them is Dunsparce. Dunsparce is the only other Pokemon besides Croconaw to learn Rage this early in the game, only Dunsparce uses it significantly better because they get same type attack bonus, and have more HP to work with, making them a lot less reliant on Clefairy cooperating with them than Croconaw was. In all my testing, they only lost like 2 or 3 battles, and at least one of those was completely on me. Early on, I tested to see if Glare would help against Miltank, completely forgetting that using a different move removes the effects of Rage. Without me blundering like that, Whitney has to get pretty absurdly lucky in order to win. If you're not into all this setup, or evasion, or incremental attack nonsense, Flaaffy is easily the Pokemon that does the best so far with regular old one-turn attacks. Using Thunder Punch from the department store, they consistently 3-shot Miltank, meaning as long as they can survive 3 attacks themselves, they can win. You can increase the odds by paralyzing Miltank. This won't decrease the amount of chances she gets to attack, but the possibility of a full paralysis can potentially give Flaaffy some free turns and break her rollout chains. If you want to use the Gold Berry, that can increase the odds from pretty consistent to winning almost every single time, as now Flaaffy will just about always survive 3 rounds of rollout. Flaaffy can still occasionally lose if Whitney crits, or if she randomly decides to go for Stomp instead. They never lost this way in my testing, but one time they did survive what was clearly a range. So far, even the best Pokemon against Whitney have been at least a little bit reliant on accuracy, or on the AI cooperating with them. Quagsire very consistently gets the sweep using only 100% accurate moves that work completely independently of what the AI does. Quagsire can learn Rollout and do pretty good with it, but I think the far better strat for Quagsire is just getting Miltank's defense as low as possible with Tail Whip and breaking her Rollout chains with Dig. The risk factor against Clefairy is almost completely minimized, as she really only gets 1 chance to attack. Quagsire 2-shots with Dig without any setup, so spends most of their matchup underground. And then it's quite difficult for Miltank to make any real headway against them, because even the 2nd or 3rd round of Rollout does so little damage. Even on the very rare occasion she uses Stomp, the damage is usually pretty manageable. I think Quagsire might be the first top tier encounter. The full sweep is pretty close to riskless. There is one particular turn where it can be quite bad if Miltank crits or flinches with Stomp, although I should mention, if it wasn't clear already, for most of the Pokemon in these top 2 tiers, I didn't actually bother testing them with items like the Gold Berry, or even the regular berry, because they seemed so consistent anyway. For a lot of them, it probably would become almost astronomically rare for them to lose if they were to hold it. Ghastly is a rather tough Pokemon to rank, because they do have some lines that are really good if they work, but whether or not they work is very luck dependent. Regardless, they can play a very useful supporting role in this gym. If they set up Curse against Miltank, it eliminates a quarter of her health every turn, making it far easier for you to stall her out, and conversely far harder for her to stall you out. It's actually a very useful tool to have against an opponent that uses things like Attract or Confusion. In terms of 1v1ing Miltank themselves, though, the only attacking move they can learn at this point in the adventure which can actually hit normal types is Thunder. They can sometimes get through if Thunder hits pretty much every time, and Hypnosis hits within a turn or two, and Miltank stays asleep long enough. Just by themselves, the line seems pretty shaky, but with a Gold Berry, it can be made a little more consistent. Generally though, after setting up Curse, it would probably be a better idea to just swap to another Pokemon. Ghastly makes the higher middling tier for their supporting role more than anything else. So, we all know that Unknown, under normal circumstances, is not going to be able to defeat Miltank. That's just a given. I was curious to see, though, if it could be done under the most implausibly favorable circumstances. As it turned out, at the DVs I was testing every Pokemon at, Hidden Power happened to be Fighting 68, nearly the best possible combination for this gym. Hidden Power is a 3-shot in this instance, meaning if Unknown can survive 3 rounds of Rollout, they can win. I tried it from full health, and the only way this can happen is if one of Miltank's rollouts misses. This is not worthy of making a higher tier, but an Unknown sweep of Whitney's gym is theoretically possible. Onix is the other snake Pokemon I was referring to earlier that does great in this gym. They basically combine the best parts of Geodude and Quagsire. The resistances and high defense from Geodude, the ability to lower Miltank's defense from Quagsire, and the ability to use Dig to break her rollout chains from both of them. Screech is somewhat inaccurate, which is annoying, but it does lower defense by 2 stages, and Onix gets so much opportunity to act compared to most of the other Pokemon I tested. Even Stomp does nothing. They might actually be the single best Pokemon for this gym so far. They are slightly worse against Clefairy than Quagsire is because they do miss the 2-shot with Dig, giving Clefairy 1 extra turn, but I simply can't ignore that they're the only Pokemon in this experiment so far that pretty much completely walls Miltank. Okay, basically, Bellsprout can only win if they manage to set up all 6 growths on Clefairy, and have enough HP left over that they aren't just immediately KO'd by Stomp. In that very specific scenario, they can win, but it's so unlikely. Stomp does well over half of Bellsprout's health, and keeping Clefairy at bay requires both hitting with Sleep Powder every time, and the sleep lasting long enough. And just as a cherry on top, Vine Whip still misses the KO on Clefairy even with special attack maxed out, so Clefairy still gets 1 more turn to potentially be annoying. Even if all of that works out, Miltank still has to cooperate a bit and not use Stomp. Otherwise, it was all for naught. A bunch of pretty boring results in a row now. Skiploom isn't really worth talking about, they're pretty much completely incapable of doing damage at this level. Paras is kind of just a repeat of Beedrill. If they hold a Gold Berry, they can rarely sweep with Fury Cutter, but they rely on either Rollout missing, or on Whitney's Pokemon hitting very specific damage ranges. Poliwag gets basically no moves at this level, they can barely even defeat Clefairy. Gyarados you would probably expect better from, but the only half-decent move they get at this point is Headbutt, and Miltank can easily stall them out with Milk Drink, and Goldeen doesn't get anything better than Horn Attack. Alright, Slowpoke. If you watched my Gold and Silver review from a few months ago, you might remember that this was the method I used to get past Whitney in my playthrough. Slowpoke learns Curse, one of the best setup moves in the game, raising both the user's attack and defense, at the cost of lowering their speed, but most Pokemon that learn the move are slow anyway. Set up 5 or 6 of them, and Clefairy is a consistent 1-shot, while Miltank is a consistent 2-shot. It's obviously pretty precarious leaving Clefairy on the field, often using Metronome for so long, but Slowpoke does have decent HP and physical defense, so the vast majority of the time, they'll be fine. It's barely even necessary, but if you do roll the 2% chance of finding a King's Rock on a wild Slowpoke, and you aren't planning on evolving yours into Slowbro instead, then you might as well perform the trade evolution and get Slowking. It does mean you have to spend 1 less turn setting up against Clefairy in order to get the 2-shot, so there's less of a chance for her to pull off some crazy RNG. Plus, Slowking has significantly higher special defense, so if Clefairy does metronome some powerful super effective special attack, Slowking can take it a lot better. For that reason, I think I want to put Slowking in the top tier in spite of how long they have to leave Clefairy out. I mean, I had an attempt where Clefairy got locked into Petal Dance and got off 2 of them, yet Slowking still won. Of all the Pokemon that were able to snag at least one win against Miltank, I think Oddish was the one that surprised me the most. The only proper attacking move they get at this level is Absorb, the weakest grass-type move in the game, but if they're able to hit with Sleep Powder, they can break Miltank's rollout chains, get a few free hits, and recover a lot of health in the process. This is heavily dependent on Sleep Orangey, especially when her health gets low. It pretty much only takes one Milk Drink for Oddish to risk getting stalled out of PP, especially if they've taken on the Clefairy as well, but it can happen. I have the recorded proof. Drowsy is another Pokemon that just doesn't get any moves they can really take advantage of at this point in the adventure. At one point I tried a strategy where Drowsy would disable Rollout while Miltank was locked into it, but it just broke the chain. It didn't force Miltank to use Struggle or anything like that. Even if it did, I don't think it would be especially helpful. Kadabra does a lot of damage, but unfortunately, Stomp from Miltank does about 90% of their health, so if they get attacked by Clefairy at all, they just lose automatically. If they can get through Clefairy taking only a negligible amount of damage or less, Miltank is more likely to go for Rollout, and if that happens, Kadabra probably wins, as they survive the second round from Rollout, and they also happen to be one of the very few Pokemon in the game that outspeeds Miltank. The best way of minimizing Clefairy's chances of doing damage is to teach Kadabra Fire Punch and have them hold the Charcoal, as that makes for a far more reliable 2-shot than Confusion does. But one Double Slap and Kadabra is screwed. Oh, and remember, Miltank can also sometimes just randomly go for Stomp anyway. No way to recover if that happens. So, it's not a very good idea to go for the sweep, but Whitney's questionable AI decisions do make the 1v1 with Miltank quite likely. Alakazam plays pretty much the exact same way. They don't gain that much defensive stats upon evolution, but it's still a lot more likely for them to get through Clefairy, taking little enough damage so that Miltank doesn't immediately KO with Stomp. And this makes the sweep a lot more consistent. It was around this point in my testing that I was actually starting to get kind of annoyed at how rarely Whitney used Stomp. Seeing how much damage it actually does is very valuable data for this test, but it's almost impossible to be sure when a Pokemon faints. HP doesn't display into the negatives. I'm a little hesitant to put Alakazam this high on the tier list because, on paper, this line doesn't seem all that consistent. It feels like it should happen at least some of the time that Clefairy gets a lot of strikes with Double Slap, Miltank uses Stomp right away, and then the Berry isn't enough to bring Alakazam out of KO range from another Stomp, but Alakazam never lost that way once during my testing. I did get that sequence of events one time, but Alakazam saved themselves by burning Miltank with Fire Punch. In the end, I feel like I just have to go with the results I got, over the results I feel like I should have gotten. Besides, even if this weird AI pattern wasn't a thing, Alakazam could easily push themselves into this tier with a Gold Berry. I'd probably recommend some of the other high-ranking Pokemon in a Nuzlocke context, since a crit from Stomp will just KO from full health, but I don't think it would be fair to bump Alakazam down the tier list because of that. We've established that even the top tier counters aren't totally risk-free. So, Ditto, like Unown, is not a Pokemon that anyone would use in battle under any, even semi-serious context. They use Transform so you can wind up with the same Pokemon as the opponent, except a turn behind, with only 5 PP in each of your moves, and with Ditto's usually worse HP. Is it completely implausible for Ditto to get a 1v1 against Miltank? Probably not. I'm sure there's a world where Miltank misses with Rollout like 5 turns in a row, and Ditto lands a crit so they don't get stalled out of PP with Milk Drink, but really, who cares? Even if that sequence of events is more likely than I think it is, nobody is even going to attempt this if they have any real desire to win the battle. Pineco is yet another rollout sweeper, though unfortunately not a very good one, largely in part due to being weak to rollout themselves. They're the only Pokemon available at this point in the adventure who learns Protect, but even using that to break Miltank's rollout chains, they're still usually just going to take too much damage. They could only win sometimes with a Gold Berry, and even with that, they would often just take too much damage from Clefairy, or have their own rollout chain broken with a miss. Both situations being pretty much impossible to recover from. Kind of like Ghastly, Pineco is probably more useful as a support tool, albeit as an absolute last resort one. They do take out about 90% of Miltank's health with Self-Destruct, so maybe that can bail you out if you see no other way through. Nidorina comes very close to being able to simply solo the fight with Double Kick, and maybe one with a really good attack stat could, but most of the time, she just barely isn't able to do enough to KO Miltank before Miltank finishes her off with Rollout. She can only get the win if at least one of the rollouts misses. She'd probably be a really good Miltank counter if she had a way of breaking the rollout chain intentionally, but the best she can do is use Double Slap and hope that that causes a miss. Unfortunately, this evolutionary family cannot learn Dig, which is just bizarre to me. Not only do they evolve into a ground type, aren't they literally based on rabbits? Maybe the animals best known for digging? Without that tool, the average Nidorina just does not cut it. Nidoqueen, on the other hand, might just be the single best Whitney counter in the entire game. No fancy tricks or anything, Nidoqueen just uses Double Kick and wins. After evolving, she is now able to consistently get the 3-shot on Miltank, and even Stomp does well under a third of Nidoqueen's health. We've established how unlikely Whitney's AI is to use Stomp in the first place. In order for Nidoqueen to even have a chance of losing, Miltank has to use Stomp every single turn, and it has to flinch or crit. Speaking of things that Whitney's AI is quite unlikely to even do, but Nidoqueen is still well equipped for in the off chance that she does, Nidoqueen also cannot be attracted by Miltank. That's the one thing that even the other top tier counters couldn't reliably play around unless you happen to have a female. Using only her level up learn set and no items, Nidoqueen didn't lose a single battle during my testing. She rarely even got out of green health. Having slightly higher attack, you might expect Nidorino to fare a bit better than his female counterpart, but unfortunately, I guess the difference in attack is a bit too marginal to make a tangible difference at this level, so Nidorino misses the 3-shot anyway. Not only that, he's actually considerably less likely to even get 3 chances to attack, since while it might be a range, Nidorino can just get knocked out by the 3rd round of Rollout, which Nidorina consistently survived. Same as before, Nidorino's best chance is using Mud Slap and hoping for misses. After evolving, Nidoking plays about the same way Nidoqueen does. He just uses Double Kick and wins. The pair of them may have slightly different stats, but the margin is small enough that it doesn't make any tangible difference to the amount of attacks they can take from Miltank, nor the amount of attacks Miltank can take from them. He is a slightly worse counter than Nidoqueen because he can get attracted by Miltank, but even this doesn't make too much of a difference. I had one attempt where he got attracted and stopped from attacking twice, and he still won. It might still keep him out of the very top tier. For Quagsire, Onix, and Slowking, you can avert this by getting a female one, while with Nidoking there's no way of avoiding this possibility. But without getting pretty absurdly unlucky with Stomp, that is pretty much the only way he can lose. Yanma is a total non-start because even the first hit from Rollout does more than half of their health. I even tried with Double Team, but then Miltank could easily just stall them out, because Yanma doesn't do shit damage-wise. Sunkern is also a non-start, kind of to be expected from the Pokemon with the lowest base stat total in the game. They do just barely avoid a KO from full health when Miltank uses Stomp, but they can't do any substantial damage in return. They learn a setup move in Growth, but they have no real opportunity to use it because even Clefairy metronoming very weak moves does way too much damage. Sunflora might have the single most drastic change in a Pokemon's performance after evolving. Sunflora does need to set up 3 growths to reliably 2-shot Miltank, and 4 to reliably 1-shot Clefairy, though you could alternatively use Razorleaf if HP isn't a concern, and their defenses still aren't great, so setting these up can seem a bit risky. However, they get a significant amount of health back from Mega Drain. A lot of Pokemon were just screwed if they took too much damage while setting up against Clefairy, but Sunflora could easily heal themselves out of KO range. Even getting crit or flinched by Miltank, or Clefairy rolling Light Screen with Metronome that one time, Sunflora could just shake off. the ability to restore their own HP is clearly a very valuable asset for a Pokemon to have in this fight, and Sunflora is not going to be the only Pokemon that demonstrates this. Execute is another Pokemon that you can evolve this early, specifically in Crystal if you jump through some hoops, but it's hardly even necessary because Execute does just fine on their own. If they simply put Miltank to sleep and set up Leech Seed, they can quite easily just stall her out. Compared to some other Pokemon that relied on sleeping moves to make any headway, Execute is a lot less frail, and the guaranteed slight amount of damage to Miltank and slight amount of replenished health at the end of every turn makes a huge difference. It also helps that Execute can do some decent direct damage by attacking with Confusion as well. They do strongly rely on being able to hit a Hypnosis on Miltank before they simply run out of health, but they have to miss 3 or 4 times in a row for this not to work. So the vast majority of the time, Execute can pull this off, and if you keep a Reflect set up, you can give them even more time to put Miltank to sleep before rollout damage gets a bit too scary. Since Execute relies a lot more on their defensive strats for their main strategy, which aren't too significantly increased upon evolution, Executor isn't even that much better a counter to Miltank. They do a bit more damage with Confusion, but that's about it. I'm at a bit of a crossroad here, because I don't know if, in good faith, I should be putting Pokemon who rely on not 1, but 2 inaccurate moves in the very top tier. I also didn't do quite as many runs with these 2 as most of the other Pokemon I tested, since the strategy is very slow and stally, but neither of them ever lost in any of the runs I did. They never even came close, really. Wobbuffet is probably the only Pokemon in the entire game that actually has an easier time defeating Miltank than they do Clefairy. It's mostly to do with the fact that when Clefairy uses Double Slap and Wobbuffet tries to follow it up with Counter, only the last strike from Double Slap is considered. Also, Clefairy can roll a special move with Metronome, which is impossible to predict. Miltank, however, only knows physical attacks, that only strike once on any given turn. Wobbuffet can just spam Counter, and more often than not, depending on damage rolls, rollout accuracy, and whether they got attracted or flinched, they will win. Remember that Miltank, from what I've seen anyway, is more likely to use Attract on Pokemon that were just sent in for the 1v1 than Pokemon that were already out going for the sweep. So with Wobbuffet especially, I would recommend looking for a female more than most of the other Pokemon I tested. Venonat gets 2-shot by rollout and doesn't get shit for moves, so no point in testing them any further. Scyther is very simple to explain. The only usable move they get at this point is Fury Cutter. If they hit with Fury Cutter all 5 turns, and Clefairy doesn't roll anything too crazy with Metronome, they win. If they miss any, except maybe one of the first 2 against Clefairy, or Clefairy rolls Zap Cannon and actually hits or something, they lose. Being double weak to it, Scyther is another Pokemon that gets 2-shot by rollout even without the incremental damage. However, they are another one of the very few Pokemon available that actually outspeeds Miltank, so if they can 2-shot her and not get crit, they can do it. Way too risky and luck dependent to be especially recommended though. Pinsir is pretty much the exact same way, also not being able to learn anything of note except for Fury Cutter. Compared to Scyther, they can take an extra turn of rollout from Miltank, but conversely, they're also slower than her, so they also don't have much room to pivot if they miss a Fury Cutter late in the chain. That is also one extra turn Miltank could crit or flinch, so the odds are actually probably slightly worse overall. Heracross. This was always my go-to Whitney counter playing the remakes as a kid. Just catch a female one, teach them some decent fighting type move, and... where the fuck are the fighting type moves? Yeah, I went over this in my reviews of Gold, Silver, and Crystal. So many of the move pools in these games are needlessly shallow. There's no good reason why Heracross isn't able to learn Karate Chop or something at all, let alone by this level. Why even make them a fighting type then? That being said, Heracross is still easily the best of the 3 big bugs, as I'll call them. Not being weak to rollout is a huge plus. It gives them far more freedom to take a bit of damage from Clefairy, and they're also the only one that can potentially pivot to a different move, like Headbutt, or one of the friendship-based attacks if you're willing to go out of your way for those, and finish Miltank off with that. Aipom can also learn Fury Cutter somehow. I don't know what part of them is supposed to be sharp, and that's the only way they can potentially sneak in a win. Even Frustration is like a 5-shot on Miltank. Snubbull actually came surprisingly close to winning, one time. Their headbutt does do more damage than you would expect, but even getting that far was pretty fluky. Ultimately, they're just too frail. To even get close to winning, Miltank's rollout would have to miss several times in one battle, something I didn't feel was really worth resetting for. Vulpix does practically nothing, even with Fire Blast and Charcoal, though Growlithe, having higher stats, was able to sneak in one lucky win doing the exact same thing. They actually get the 2-shot with Fire Blast, so if Miltank misses one time and Growlithe doesn't, they can do it. After evolving into Arcanine, they can take 2 rollouts. Now, the only prerequisite for a win is hitting with Fire Blast both times. This is a rare scenario where it might actually be preferable for Miltank to open with Stomp. The amount of damage taken doesn't change the amount of rollouts Arcanine can take, so as long as it doesn't flinch immediately, it actually increases the amount of chances Arcanine gets to attack. Stantler can also win fairly often by just playing super aggressively, usually being able to take 3 rounds of Miltank's rollout depending on how much damage they took from Clefairy, and sometimes being able to take rollout down in 3 shots with Headbutt, depending on damage ranges, the stats you roll, and whether or not Stantler holds a pink bow. However, I do think they had a much better win rate going for Hypnosis. Miltank can start to stall with Milk Drink if she's left awake, and breaking rollout chains helps quite a bit as well. A pretty high tier Pokemon, though not sure they'd have had quite the win rate they did without the pink bow. Psyduck does nothing. Even if they somehow take no damage, they learn no attacks that can't just be stalled out with Milk Drink. And this brings us to Machop, specifically Muscle the Machop. This is the obvious designer-intended Miltank counter that the game kind of points you towards, being available to the player via an in-game trade in the Goldenrod department store. So based on that, you would probably expect her to be one of the very best counters in the game. And she actually is quite good, although she's another one that I expect would be significantly lower on the tier list if Whitney's AI would actually use Stomp more often. It does well over a third of Machop's health, so without a Gold Berry, she would just be screwed if Whitney decided to use it 3 times in a row. And you might think that would be a bit more common in this scenario, since Rollout is resisted by the target and Stomp isn't, but nope. Even though she has another move that does more damage than a round 3 rollout immediately, her AI still greatly prefers rollout for whatever reason. She can also get a bit stally with Milk Drink because Muscle the Machop doesn't quite get the 2-shot, but if it really comes down to it, Milk Drink will run out of PP before Karate Chop does. I never really tested Muscle without the Gold Berry, in part because it took so long for me to get a battle where it actually activated that I forgot she was even holding it, but that should say that even without it, she's in the second to top tier at least. With it, she's practically untouchable. Hitmonchan is another fighting type that doesn't actually get any fighting type moves in time for this gym. The only attack he learns by level up at this point is Comet Punch. The Elemental Punch TMs from the department store are no help at all because they're special attacks in this game. The only way Hitmonchan was able to sneak in a win was by using Agility to outspeed Miltank, and then getting like 4 flinches in a row from Headbutt. Hitmonlee is yet another Pokemon that would be a bit screwed if Whitney's AI was just a tiny bit better, and actually went for her better move more often. He can set up 2 Meditates on Clefairy and consistently one-shot with Double Kick, but he is outsped and 2-shot by Miltank's Stomp. If she went for it consistently, ignoring Attract or anything Clefairy might do, he would have an approximately 70% chance of winning, due to the possibility of getting flinched. If he were to hold a berry of any kind, the chance would increase to around 90%, since now it would have to flinch twice in a row. However, since we know already that her AI almost never goes for Stomp, his odds in this scenario are well past those figures. I don't know if I can put him in the top tier even with the berry. He is frail enough that setting up on Clefairy can be an issue, but he's ranked quite highly for sure. Hitmontop seems quite similar to Machop on paper. Like Machop, on the rare occasion she actually uses it, Miltank does a little over a third of Hitmontop's health with Stomp. Unlike Machop, however, Hitmontop does consistently 2-shot with Rolling Kick, but Rolling Kick can miss. The fact that he relies on a pretty inaccurate move and has no way of raising his stats or renewably replenishing his health makes it seem like there should be some risk factor with Hitmontop, but in practice, he almost never seemed to come anywhere close to losing during any of my attempts with him, even not holding an item. Honestly, I think the only reason I'm not putting them in the very top tier is the same reason as Nidoking. No way to play around Attract. A few more baby Pokemon in a row now, only these ones can't actually evolve within this level cap. Magby actually does pretty decent damage, but one Rollout puts them in KO range for either Stomp or the second round of Rollout, so they don't really get too far. Smoochum ties with Pichu as the worst Miltank counter in the whole game, being simply outsped and one-shot by Miltank no matter what. And Elekid can actually win sometimes if they hold the Gold Berry. They do have to get quite lucky. However, looking back at my footage, I'm realizing a fair amount of their losses were on me. I kinda forgot that Elekid had Quick Attack in their moveset. Anytime in this footage you see Miltank beating Elekid with a sliver of HP remaining, Elekid probably would have won that matchup if I'd just used the priority move instead. Whoops. I was starting to get a bit burnt out at this point in my testing, so I may have been kind of rushing to get it done. For that, I'll give Elekid the benefit of the doubt and put them in the middling tier. With an asterisk, of course. Tentacool couldn't even defeat Clefairy with their level up learn set. The only better move they get is Blizzard. Even if they get a chance to attack Miltank, which they rarely do, they would easily just get stalled out with Milk Drink. Krabby is the last Fury Cutter sweeper, and they're okay at it. Both their physical attack and defense is quite high for an unevolved Pokemon. Their biggest problem is Clefairy. She's given a lot of chances to be annoying, but if they manage to land the 5th hit on Miltank, it is a one-shot. And then, Teddiursa and Phanpy are the last two Rollout sweepers. I've talked enough about these, you get the drill with them by now, so might as well knock them both out quickly. Teddiursa got pretty horrendous luck with both accuracy and with the moves Clefairy rolled for a lot of my testing, but even accounting for that, I think they'd be a pretty shaky answer at best. They're very defensively frail, so they do pretty much have to hit all 5 turns to get the sweep. And still sometimes they just take too much damage from Clefairy first. Phanpy is considerably better, being able to learn Defense Curl and resisting Miltank's rollout, though they're not quite as good at using it as the likes of Sandshrew or Furret, because Phanpy is less defensive, can't learn Dig despite being a ground type, and isn't really able to pivot to a different move if the rollout streak fails. Nearly done now. Cubone is kind of Quagsire at home, doing something very similar but not nearly as well. Their main strategy is also lowering Miltank's defense and using Dig, but they have far lower stats than Quagsire, so they don't win nearly as often. Whitney's AI was a little hard for them to play around as well. She would often go for Stomp when it looked like she would go for a heal, even though Stomp didn't roll a KO that turn, which kind of messed up my timing whenever it happened. Still, I really should have used this strategy when I played through Crystal for that review. I kind of just brute forced my way through Whitney that time. And finally, Dratini sucks. I know it's anticlimactic to end on this, but there's really just nothing to say about them. Even Fire Blast with Charcoal is a 3-shot on Clefairy, and that's the best move they get at this point in the game. And that is all 81 available Pokemon tested. Sorry if it felt like I was starting to rush through them a bit towards the end, but when there's that many to talk about, a lot of the strategies used do start to get a bit samey, especially with the 20 Pokemon whose best strategy was spamming Rollout or Fury Cutter. This experiment yielded very different results to the last one I did. In the Watson video, I think that experiment showed that his reputation is kind of earned. That tier list was very bottom heavy. Around 2/3 of the Pokemon available were simply unable to defeat his Magneton. This tier list, on the other hand, is a lot more evenly spread. There are a lot of Pokemon easily available to the player that are really good against Whitney and her Miltank, so why was she always perceived as such a struggle? Well, the simple answer is that everyone who believed this was just a dumb kid who sucked at the game, but I do have a theory that gets a little more specific than that. I mentioned earlier towards the start of the video that for most gym leaders, the battle style that players would be used to using is just finding a hard-hitting super effective move and spamming it, but there aren't many Pokemon available to the player that can do this against Whitney, especially in Gold and Silver, and the few that do exist, the player generally has to go well out of their way to obtain. If you look at all the Pokemon that rank highly on this tier list, you might notice a common theme that, with a few obvious exceptions like Nidoqueen or Machop, most of them tended not to play super aggressively. Instead, the strategies they used mostly hinged upon slowly building up moves that increment over time, using moves that boost their own stats or lower Whitney's stats, taking evasive or preventative maneuvers, stalling her out with field hazards and status conditions. I found that this battle strongly encouraged the player to make use of alternative strategies that weren't just immediately use the strongest move, something that many, especially inexperienced players, probably wouldn't think to do. I know when I first started playing as a kid, I pretty much thought any move that didn't immediately do a lot of damage was just useless. And this is why, even though it got a bit tedious and repetitive towards the end, largely due to there being more than double the amount of Pokemon to test, I actually think I enjoyed this experiment considerably more. The Watson battle really only rewarded Pokemon that could get through by mindlessly spamming one attack, but with the Whitney battle, I actually felt like I was often being rewarded for getting a bit more creative with my strategies and trying a wider variety of moves and Pokemon. I mean, the Watson video had nothing like some of the best counters in the whole game being Execute, Slowpoke, and Dunsparce. Let me know if there are any other bosses in the Pokemon series you'd like to see this done with. Thanks for watching, goodbye.